Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
According to Amnesty International, 15 countries used the death penalty in 2024. The United States was one of those countries. Capital punishment is illegal in 23 states, and it isn't used in some of the states where it is legal. But the United States still executed 25 people last year. We've already surpassed that number in 2025. Capital punishment has long been a contentious topic, and it's a debate that's been reignited in recent weeks, as President Donald Trump has said that he wants to seek the death penalty for all murder cases in Washington, D.C. But amid all the statistics and lofty arguments for and against the practice, it's important to remember that capital punishment affects real people. It has an impact on the people sentenced to death and the families who've lost loved ones to violence. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about what the death penalty means to the human beings who are affected by it. Atlantic staff writer and two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist Elizabeth Bruenig has seen the impact of the death penalty firsthand. She's also lost a family member to violence. A quick note for our listeners. In this episode, we talk about violent crime and capital punishment. If these are triggering topics for you, please take care of yourself and sit this one out. This is also not an episode for our younger listeners. Liz, thank you so much for joining us on Disrupted.
Thank you so much for having me on.
You are a writer and a journalist who does not shy away from challenging topics and themes. And one of those topics is talking about capital punishment. You had a recent cover story for The Atlantic called Witness: Inside America's Death Chambers, tracking that work. Talking about capital punishment is never easy. Covering the depth and the context and the texture of these experiences the way that you do is never easy. But it's particularly challenging, Liz, because you not only write about this, you have attended the executions of 5 men who were on death row. Share with our listeners the decision or the journey for you to say, this is the area that I really want to focus on for my work.
Yes. So, I'd always been interested in capital punishment because it is so challenging for a society. But in 2016, my sister-in-law was murdered by an ex-boyfriend in our old hometown of Texas. I met my husband in high school. His sister also went to our high school. And, it was a huge shock for my family. And, I was quite impressed by the way that they comported themselves. They did not want the death penalty. The state did not charge him with first-degree murder, and so the death penalty wasn't an option. But there's some time between the murder and the charges being filed. And in that time period, the family didn't know if it would be charged as a first-degree murder. But they came to this agreement that if it was, they didn't want the death penalty.
You have this personal experience to this, a personal connection, much like my own. And what I find, Liz, so intriguing is probably not the word, but it is one of the reasons why this is such a topic that I'm glad we're talking about, is that capital punishment is an issue that most people have an immediate response to, right? People can almost immediately tell you whether they support it or not. And it's such a complex topic. It matters how a crime is classified. It often matters where a crime has happened, with certain geographical pieces of the country being more likely to pursue capital punishment than others. There are decades of research now that show that it makes a difference based on identity of the victim, identity of the perpetrator, all of these layers and complexities. Digging into that complexity, you didn't just write about capital punishment. You didn't just talk about your family's tragic experience. You also applied to a federal office to have access to witness an execution in person. Talk to me about that process of making that very difficult decision to be present in what you were writing about.
So this was in 2020. It was at the very end of Trump's term that he decided to resume federal executions, which had been paused for many years, for no particular reason, really. It just wasn't pursued. And I think there might have been some difficulty accessing the drugs. But Trump resumed these executions and I think executed 13 people in 6 months. So while that execution spree was going on, I was following it and I finally thought, I should just see it for myself. I should report it for myself because I don't think people realize necessarily the gravity of what's going on. And so I decided to witness and I applied to be a media witness at this federal execution. And that was the first execution that I witnessed.
Talk to me about how you, as a journalist, as a person, prepare for that experience. Again, this is not something that most people know or have ever experienced. You and I both know that it's not an experience like what we see in the movies where a decision is made, a button is pushed, and then it's over. It can be very long, very protracted, very torturous for the person, but also for those witnessing. How do you prepare yourself to step into that experience? Because as you document in your writing, you never really know what you will see and what you will experience.
Yes, I myself sort of had the expectation that it wouldn't be particularly bad because I had bought into the propaganda that lethal injection is a medical, scientific form of execution that they've gotten down to a science. And I expected that it would be just like watching someone go to sleep for surgery under anesthesia or something, and then, not wake up. I believed it might be peaceful. And that was not what happened. Alfred Bourgeois was the man I saw executed, and after the lethal drugs began to flow, I mean, his body sort of heaved and jerked on the gurney, and it took several minutes for him to die. He looked conscious of the pain when his body was moving and moving quite violently on the gurney. That surprised me. I was not prepared for that. And as soon as I exited the witness room, I threw up. I was completely shaken by it. And I thought to myself, if people knew what it was like, that it's not this scientific medical procedure, they might reevaluate what they think about executions because, it does seem cruel and unusual. And as a nation, we should be above that.
One of the things that I really appreciate about your writing, in particular the way that you talk about Alfred Bourgeois, there's often this attempt to create this trope of downplaying how horrible the crimes are that have been committed by people or the extreme inhumanity that was shown to victims. You are very clear that you describe him as, quote, a deeply unsympathetic figure. And you attended, as you said, his execution in Indiana in 2020. I think that point is so critical here to understanding that what you're saying is not that you are extending greater sympathy or greater alignment with the person who has perpetrated a crime, but you are asking a bigger question about what we think is happening versus what is actually happening and how we reconcile the two. Tell us a little more about this case of Alfred Bourgeois and how you see it playing out into these greater debates about not necessarily whether we should have the death penalty, but some of those complications that you witness in terms of how it is actually carried out.
So Alfred Bourgeois was a truck driver, and he happened to be, I think, delivering a shipment in Corpus Christi, Texas, on a naval base. Because those are federal property and the crime happened there, he was given the federal death penalty. While he was making this shipment, he had his toddler daughter with him named Jacaren. And he had recently come into custody of her and oftentimes brought his family with him on his truck trips and, had been struggling, it seemed. His wife and Alfred had been struggling, it seemed, with taking care of this little girl while, taking these long haul truck routes. At some point in Corpus Christi, Alfred Bourgeois seemed to shake the girl and bash her head against the inside of the cab of his truck. He killed her. He was arrested, arraigned, convicted, and then sentenced to death. The prosecution argued that Alfred Bourgeois had sexually abused the little girl based on some chemical evidence they recovered from inside her body. Now, come to find out, that kind of chemical evidence was later sort of discredited. Even by the FBI, they stopped using that test. So I'm skeptical of that. But the prosecution in death penalty cases is free to present unadjudicated aggravating factors, meaning they can claim someone committed a crime without having to actually adjudicate that crime, without charging the person, trying them, and convicting them. So prosecutors are able to put ideas like the sexual molestation of a little girl in front of a jury, which, I think heavily prejudices them towards the death penalty because it's so outrageous. The little girl's family was obviously heartbroken by what happened, but other members of Alfred's family were still on good terms with him. As he was executed, he claimed that he was innocent, specifically of the sexual abuse. And it kind of sticks with me, the question of whether that really happened. The prosecution certainly asserted it did, but reading through the girl's medical records and autopsy records, which I did, it seemed doubtful to me. And so that sticks with me, is that sometimes people seem to be sentenced to death based on these completely unadjudicated claims, which seems very unjust.
We all know our legal system is imperfect. Some people have argued that the system of capital punishment in the United States is inherently and irreparably flawed. But I imagine, Liz, that for some people, they would listen to the details of this case and say, you know what, I don't care. I don't care that he did not commit this part of a heinous crime. What I know is that this young girl is no longer with her family. And part of what we see in this debate, and I've experienced it myself, is that there becomes this idea that we only need to focus on one part of a situation in order to make society feel safer. And what you also write about is that no one walks away from a capital punishment case feeling whole. Not for the family who lost a loved one. People would often say to me, well, at the end of the trial, you'll have closure. Closure does not exist for families like ours who have lost someone that we cared about. And so the families of the victims don't feel whole. The family of the person who was executed does not feel whole. And you actually, in your writing, talk to family members of the victim, of the perpetrator, to think about how they remember their loved ones, but also what going forth looks like. Share with our listeners a bit of that experience of, even after this execution has occurred, talking to family members. Share with us a bit about that.
Yeah, so I've talked to family members of victims as well as family members of perpetrators. And one thing that really surprised me is that when I started interviewing people who were affected by these executions, members of families, I expected all of them, to a person, would be extremely enthusiastic about the execution because they've lost so much and they're in such pain. I would understand that reaction. I disagree with it, and I don't think it leads to just outcomes. But I understand why people feel that way. But what I was surprised to find is quite a few members of victims' families end up opposing the execution. of the offender. And, in some cases, really become friends with the offender. So, one woman I knew, Sarah Gregory, her grandmother had been murdered by a man named Jimmy Barber in Alabama. Jimmy had been the boyfriend of Sarah Gregory's aunt, so the daughter of the woman who was executed, but was estranged at the time. But he had been very well known to their family and had been on good terms with all of them before this happened. And so for many years, the family was extremely angry at him and very satisfied with the idea of his execution. But Sarah, over time, felt like she just had to let go of that hatred. And so she wrote Jimmy a letter in prison, and she said, "I forgive you because I need to move past this. I can't have this weighing down my heart anymore." And so she forgave him. Jimmy wrote back and they developed a relationship. They would talk on the phone about their lives, about Sarah's son and being with her family and what that felt like. And she came to oppose the execution. So did her mother. On the day of the execution, they attended. And before Jimmy was put to death, they saw him on the visitation yard and they hugged him and they cried. Sarah told me that day that he had changed. Other families of victims have felt the same way. So the execution of Joe Nathan James took place in Alabama as well. And the family of his victim, Faith Hall, her family, her brother and her daughters, came to quite vocally oppose the execution. They wanted the opportunity to forgive Joe Nathan James and to make amends. Prosecutors seem to care a lot about what victims' families desire in terms of the death penalty, as long as those family members are for the death penalty. But prosecutors seem to completely ignore it when victims' families are against the death penalty. And I think in the case of Faith Hall, the Attorney General's office callously refused to interact with the victim's family. And it was hard not to see a racial component there. Faith Hall was Black, her family was Black, and the Attorney General's office and the office of the governor just ignored them completely, like they didn't exist. And it struck me that there was probably another component going on there besides just the state's desire to execute.
You're listening to my conversation with Atlantic staff writer Elizabeth Bruenig about the death penalty. Coming up, Liz tells us why some people believe the death penalty can make things more difficult for victims' families.
The death penalty can be a much more painful and protracted process that sort of militates against closure because it sort of never ends.
This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about the complexities of the death penalty. A quick note for our listeners. In this segment, we talk about violent crime and capital punishment, including methods of execution. We're still joined by Elizabeth Bruenig, staff writer for The Atlantic. Her July 2025 cover story is called Witness: Inside America's Death Chambers. The article covers Elizabeth's personal experience, including the 5 executions that she's witnessed firsthand. She writes that seeing these executions, quote, has not changed my conviction that capital punishment must end, but in sometimes unexpected ways, it has changed my understanding of why. I asked Liz to tell us more about why she believes the practice must end.
So the death penalty constitutionally seems to run against our values, our Bill of Rights. There have been lots and lots of challenges to the death penalty based on the fact that it's cruel and unusual. In 1972, the NAACP brought a case before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court wound up placing a moratorium on the death penalty nationwide for 4 years because they were persuaded that the death penalty is arbitrarily applied based on factors like race. The death penalty, it is racially biased. People are much more likely to be sentenced to death if they are a Black offender who killed a white victim versus a Black offender who killed a Black victim or a white offender who killed a Black victim. People are put in a position to place value on other people's lives, and their biases come out. They don't necessarily place identical value on everyone's lives. The death penalty is also not as easily administered as people seem to think. Lethal injection is not necessarily medical, scientific, quick, and painless. There have been multiple botched lethal injections. One of them was of Doyle Ham in Alabama, who was very sick at the time of his execution. And the execution staff was just unable to connect a needle with a vein. They stuck him all over his body, his hands, arms, feet. When they couldn't establish a connection to any vein that way, they decided to try to connect the needle to an artery in his groin, and they pierced his bladder. It was a completely botched execution by people who clearly were not trained in that kind of procedure. And it does run afoul of cruel and unusual punishment. States realize this, and they have been trying to come up with execution methods that sort of satisfy the requirements to avoid cruel and unusual punishment. One of the new methods they have just introduced in Alabama and now Louisiana and other states is nitrogen hypoxia, which is a gas suffocation death. That was supposed to be quick and painless as well, but actually it takes, I think, up to 30 minutes. People seem conscious of the fact that they're suffocating. They also sort of tremble and jerk on the gurney. They, in Kenny Smith's case, lose consciousness and then come back. It seems torturous, and I think that should matter to people. But even if none of that matters, the death penalty, if someone is just looking at it very practically, is very expensive. When it comes to spending taxpayers' money, it just seems like it's a massive waste of funds and resources that could be better spent on rehabilitation or other programs, for instance, reconciliation programs that allow victims' families and offenders to reconcile. For all of those reasons, I think the death penalty is unfair, it's arbitrary, it's racist, it's expensive, and it doesn't provide the closure or finality that people think it does.
Back in 2012, I met a woman named Kimberly Davis from Georgia. We became fast friends. Kimberly Davis's brother, Troy Anthony Davis, had been executed by the state of Georgia after being accused of killing a law enforcement officer. The trending topic on social media that year became #TooMuchDoubt, because so many of the eyewitnesses who had placed him at the scene had recanted their story. And Troy Davis himself, of course, had maintained his innocence until his execution. But Liz, even the Pope spoke up about this particular case. And it became this global conversation based on what was happening in Georgia about the methods of execution, the fairness of a trial. You mentioned the racial dynamics. Kimberly Davis also said for her family, it was about class and being able to afford attorneys. In some ways, it's about gender. The overwhelming majority of people sentenced to death in this country are men. And so it raises all these questions. Here is the thing that to this day, 14 years later, still sits on my spirit when I talk about this case and when I think about Kimberly Davis. At the time that they were fighting for their brother, they learned that their sister had been diagnosed with cancer. Kimberly Davis said that for her family, what was so troubling was that the same drugs that were used to execute her brother were the drugs that were being used to try to keep her sister alive. And she asked this very simple question of, what is it that we value? If, in fact, we say that we value life, how do we make these arbitrary decisions about whose lives matter, which are expendable? And she raised that question not just about her brother, but about victims as well. And how do we say one crime is more heinous than another when for the families, the loss is the same, regardless of the circumstances of that death? I'm a political scientist. I'm a quantitative social scientist. And none of that training matters. None of those theories matter when you're talking about everyday people. It means that in this moment, I'm also thinking about all the geopolitical things that are happening around what drug cocktails and compounds the U.S. is importing to do this, and why, as other countries have said, we will no longer send things to the U.S. to be used for execution. States are now reintroducing methods that we at one point said were barbaric, and we are far beyond. Like, I've spent time doing research in Angola prison in Louisiana. I know that you've been to Parchment and other places that we think we have moved from. Talk to us about that shift, that we now have states returning to firing squads and other methods that at one point the U.S. said we are more progressive than that. What are you seeing in that landscape now?
We've had, as you're saying, quite a few different execution methods in the United States over time. I think the first execution in the territory that would become the United States in the 1600s was a hanging. For many, many years, the next 200 years, 100 years, hanging was the method of execution. But hangings are not always successful. They cannot always be carried out successfully. There were lots of botched hangings where it took a very long time for someone to die and they were sort of helpless and wriggling in the noose. And so in the United States, we began to move to the electric chair. Electricity had been newly harnessed in the 1800s, and electric chair was thought of as a scientific improvement upon hanging, that it would be much more humane. Of course, electrocution executions were also frequently botched and pretty horrific. People caught on fire, people threw up, people's eyes bled. Onlookers were, frequently horrified by the smell of people burning alive. So the electric chair went out of fashion. What came next was the gas chamber. The idea of executing someone in a chamber with poison gas was heavily borrowed from the Nazis. It was mid-century. And those executions also turned out to have a lot of problems. People would, again, take a very long time to die, would be screaming, banging their heads against the wall as they were killed by these sort of painful nerve gases. From there, lethal injection came into style. Lethal injection was pioneered in the 70s. It was analogized to the way that we euthanize animals. Was thought for that reason to be, peaceful, humane, and harmless. But that also turned out to be incorrect. And so for many years now, I think decades, attorneys for people sentenced to death have challenged lethal injection as a method. And those method challenges gummed up the works so much that districts, certain jurisdictions are now switching to older forms of execution or novel forms of execution, like nitrogen hypoxia. When Alabama executed Kenny Smith by nitrogen hypoxia as an execution method had never been tried before anywhere in the world. So this was, literal human experimentation. That's why a lot of districts have started looking for different methods. Firing squad, is of course supposed to be a quick and sure thing. And for a lot of people who write about the death penalty, I think firing squad has long been considered possibly the most humane method of execution because it is instantaneous. However, there have been recent firing squad executions in the United States that were botched. Shooters sometimes miss the person's heart, and then they're just kind of shooting into their chest where they bleed to death, which is not how firing squad is necessarily supposed to work. And so all of those factors, the failure of lethal injection, this kind of renewed interest in execution that we've seen since 2020 that's, been heavily politicized, that accounts also for this mad rush to come up with execution methods that can't be challenged and that are, seemingly humane.
I often talk in my class about the case of George Stinney, who was executed at the age of 14 in South Carolina, becoming the youngest person on record, and let me emphasize that, on record as having been executed by the state. So small and so tiny that he didn't fit into the chair that the state had. Many people look at what happened to George Stinney's family and say, our state does not want to be like that. It's raised lots of questions over the last 30, 40 years in particular about capital punishment, about whether it's too expensive for states, about whether it's compatible with what a state prioritizes. And it means that this state that I live in and that I love of Connecticut has become one of 23 states that have abolished the death penalty. Connecticut repealed it in 2012. And I was a big part of that effort because as someone who at that point had lost a loved one to violence, at this point in my life, have now lost 3 people, loved ones, to violence. I felt like no one was talking about our experience. No one was talking about victims' families. No one was talking about what it meant to be told that what we had suffered was unfortunate, but was not significant enough to have a voice in the process. I can tell you, Liz, it was the most difficult thing that I've had to do in my life. Because when we went as families together to say, we don't pretend to speak on behalf of all families, we are just saying in our voice, this is what we believe. I remember testifying before the Connecticut State Legislature and having an elected official look me in my face and say, did you really love your loved one if you don't believe that the person who killed them should be executed? And it took everything I had to maintain some dignity and composure. But I realized that even for me, as someone with all my degrees and my experience and my pedigree, that it can be difficult for people to understand dignity and humanity, even in the face of when it has been denied. What are you seeing across the country in terms of states who are saying, yes, let's listen to the experiences of victims' families, but let's also broaden the conversation so it's not just about this thing that we want to do, but being a more inclusive conversation about this? What are you seeing?
First, I'm so sorry you had to deal with that experience. It's mind-blowing that even happened. I think certain states, and certainly a lot of programs operating within death penalty states, have made the point that there are other ways, better ways to support victims' families. And I think some states have come to the conclusion, or at least certain prosecutors in some states, that the death penalty is much harder for victims' families. There was a recent high-profile case, the case of Brian Koberger, who murdered 4 college students in Moscow, Idaho. One of the victims' families heavily and vocally advocated for the death penalty. They spoke to the media and were very clear about their desire to see Koberger executed. But the prosecution did something unexpected. They accepted his guilty plea in exchange for life without parole. After that happened, this victim's family, who had been very upfront about wanting the death penalty, was angry in the press. But one thing I noticed that got less coverage than that is one of the other victims' families saying, we were so relieved when they took this plea deal. We were so relieved. We didn't have to go through a long trial. And also, we didn't have to go through the sometimes decades-long process that leads up to a person's execution. There are many, appeals. And every time a defendant wins an appeal or is, up for an appeal, especially in the higher courts, prosecutors will bring victims' families out before the press to say what an injustice it is and how angry they are in hopes of swaying those processes. Victims' families and the prosecutors who make these decisions are quite right in that the death penalty can be a much more painful and protracted process that sort of militates against closure because it sort of never ends. By the time an execution comes around and the victims' families are extended this invitation to witness the execution, which they are, it kind of takes you back to that place you were in at the time of the murders. And I feel like more and more people are beginning to realize that the death penalty comes with a lot of baggage, not only for people being executed, but for people who have been harmed by loss, by violence.
Coming up, more with Atlantic staff writer Elizabeth Bruenig. She'll talk about the possibility of redemption for people sentenced to death.
It's extremely tragic that people are executed despite having become essentially different people.
This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about the death penalty and all of its layers of nuance and complexity. As a reminder, this is not an episode for young listeners. We're still joined by Elizabeth Bruenig, staff writer at The Atlantic. Her July 2025 cover story is called Witness: Inside America's Death Chambers. In the article, Liz explores the morality of the death penalty as she writes about her experiences witnessing multiple executions in the United States. Here's more of our conversation. Violence feels so pervasive in American society, in all kinds of iterations, whether it is the direct violence that leads to the death and loss of someone, whether it is the threat of violence, the ways that we speak to one another that demean the humanity of people that we are in community and in space with. It raises all these questions about what is it that we are trying to accomplish? What is the real message or intention that we are trying to see? And I think of that, Liz, in terms of public opinion on the death penalty, which is so different now than it was in, say, the 1970s or the 1980s. The latest data from the Death Penalty Information Center says that about 53% of Americans support the death penalty. And that's just when you ask the question broadly. When you start asking more detailed questions about method, the types of crimes, or who should be eligible, then that support tends to diminish. And in spite of that, we've seen an increase in executions in states like Florida. You mentioned your home state, Texas, which has often led the way. Harris County in particular often led the way in executions. There's definitely a geographical difference there. How do we explain then that if public opinion overall is so divided on the death penalty, that we then have states that are saying we are going to execute more people? How do you explain that gap?
The states that are sort of ramping up executions, Florida is obviously on an incredible execution spree. They've executed more people so far in 2025 than they executed in all of 2024. That had to do with the Parkland shooting and the trial of the shooter, Nicholas Cruz. He was up for the death penalty. The prosecution was very adamant that he should be executed. They were very confident that he would be sentenced to death. But a couple of jurors were convinced in the penalty phase of his trial that he was mentally ill. And so he received life without parole. That seemed to really anger and embarrass Florida lawmakers, Ron DeSantis, the governor, more than anyone. And so they decided to start ramping up executions again. Of course, Donald Trump signed an executive order at the beginning of this term, directing attorneys general to encourage state attorneys general to seek the death penalty, to issue death warrants, to carry out executions. Louisiana, I think, in that vein, has recently resumed executions after a 10-year moratorium, 15-year moratorium. Even though people seem sort of divided and uncertain, especially when you present them with evidence, for example, that the death penalty puts innocent people at risk of execution, that unsettles a lot of people. But there's just a political climate right now that has to do with this administration, I think, that's leading a lot of states to sort of ignore the fact that opinion over the death penalty is divided and to go ahead, sort of guns blazing with the death penalty.
We have quickly returned to this era of rhetoric about being tough on crime. After decades of realizing that being tough on crime does not necessarily mean being smart on crime, and that there are interventions that are much more effective given the small number of people who commit death-eligible crimes, that it does not speak to the larger scope of what could be done in terms of interventions to make those meaningful changes. And at the same time, that political landscape, the rhetoric around we need to be tougher on crime, the landscape also means that we are seeing significant impacts on funding. And in particular, many of the organizations who have done the difficult work over the last 30 to 50 years to bring Americans together into conversation and also into action. There are organizations people know, like the ACLU and Amnesty International. You mentioned the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that has been very active on capital punishment for a very long time. We also learned this year that an organization called Equal Justice USA, which was very active in organizing the families here in the state of Connecticut. I worked with that organization in Maryland with Kirk Bloodsworth, who was the first American exonerated due to DNA evidence, to talk about what this means for families and for closure. We learned that Equal Justice USA will be closing after 30 years of work, and that's largely a result of federal funding cuts. What does this changing landscape for federal funding, for philanthropic support, what will that mean for the kinds of movements and organizing and changes that we witness in substantively reforming the system? What will that mean more broadly, but in particular, the work that you have interest in around the death penalty? What do you see on the landscape?
95% of people facing felony charges in the United States are indigent. I can scarcely think of anyone on death row who I know to have been able to afford their own private attorneys. And so different organizations rely quite a bit on public funds. And if you're someone who supports the death penalty, I think you should believe that work is quite critical because they stand in the way, these defenders and organizations that help people on death row stand in the way of the execution of innocent people. I mean, it's their job to make sure that the trials were fair, that the evidence was legitimate, that the person was actually eligible for the death penalty and not ineligible based on intellectual disability, mental illness, etc. Without these organizations having, massively decreased funding, the death penalty, which is already pretty arbitrary, unfair, and unjust, will become even more so as executions ramp up. But the people who are able to assist or defend these people become increasingly embattled.
Liz, I am a person of faith. My faith is critical to my life. It has pulled me through the most difficult times, including the loss of these family members. It has sustained me and challenged me. What is central to my faith is a belief in grace, a belief in mercy, a belief in redemption. And it's easy to say that, right? It is much more difficult when you are confronted with a situation that puts that to the test. Knowing how mercy and grace have shown up in my life, can I extend that to someone else? Can I extend forgiveness to someone else who has done something that I feel is unforgivable? The subtitle of your cover article is What Years of Witnessing Executions Taught Me About Sin, Mercy, and the Possibility of Redemption. So I want to ask you, what has this work taught you about sin, mercy, and the possibility of redemption?
So I'm Catholic, and the Catholic Church is quite openly anti-death penalty. Pope Francis, for example, was very adamant that the death penalty is unjust and unnecessary. And beyond just saying, well, that's the rule, being in these spaces allows you to witness not only the sort of evil of the executions, but these stories of redemption. The fact that death penalty appeals process takes sometimes decades. More than half of the people who are on death row in the United States have been there longer than 18 years. And in that time, people change radically. I'm thinking of a case that I'm working on, the case of Lamondre Tucker in Louisiana. He was arrested the same year he turned 18. He was only a few months over 18 at the time of his conviction and sentencing. The line of 18 is sort of an arbitrary demarcation when we're thinking about a brain that's still maturing. And so many years on, Lamondre is a different person. He's grown. It's extremely tragic that people are executed despite having become essentially different people over time. It's kind of a hopeless feeling that their redemption, their transformation doesn't seem to count for anything in the criminal justice system, but it matters to me, and I believe it matters to God. And I think that maintaining that possibility of redemption and of reconciliation seems so important. It seems critically important. You know, God gives a human being an entire lifetime to be redeemed over and over again, to reconcile with God over and over again. And in the death penalty, we're cutting off that possibility. And that just runs counter to what I believe the sort of heart and backbone of my faith is.
And I'll be completely honest with you. People will ask me, have you forgiven the person that took your loved one? My answer very quickly is no, because I don't believe forgiveness is mine to give. But I also know that I'm on a journey for myself. And what that reflection looks like, what that sense of redemption looks like, what it is to understand when decisions are made and how you have to live with those decisions and who has to live with those decisions, means, I think, Liz, that this is always so much more complicated than we give credit for. And when we make such finite decisions, final decisions, it shuts off the possibility of engagement. And so I'm grateful for your work because it reminds us of that complexity. It reminds us to search our own humanity and to search and interrogate the things that we believe versus the things that we live. And it also is a reminder that what we are saying now is not new, but that our commitment to conversation, to engagement, to understanding has to be renewed. And so we're grateful for the work that you do. We are grateful that you shared it with us here on Disrupted, and I look forward to reading more. Elizabeth Bruenig is staff writer at The Atlantic. She's a 2-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for her feature writing. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you so much for having me on. I could not respect you more, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to talk to you.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, Erica McIntosh, and Meg Fitzgerald. You can listen to more than 250 episodes of Disrupted via our archive. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. And you can listen for new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.